These players will absolutely disappoint you in your fantasy football championship. Make sure to sit them or at least reconsider your decision to put them in your starting lineup. I do not care how big your league is. If you appreciate this video, please go down and hit that like button. It takes 2 seconds. It's free. But make sure to stick around to the end of the video though, because I will give you one quarterback that started in 74% of leagues that needs to be sat in every single roster for the fantasy championship. But I'll never waste your time. The first must reconsider player here is going to be Rico Dowdle. This one does hurt a lot if I'm being honest. He's been amazing leading into this fantasy football championship game, finishing with 18 carries or more in 4 of his last 5, averaging 20 carries per game in that stretch. Like, by all means, those numbers are amazing, but what makes this such a bad play is because of the matchup against the Eagles here. They allow the second least amount of fantasy points to opposing running backs this year. Last week, the Commanders put up 36 points on them. Still, if we look at Brian Robinson, only 10 carries for 24 yards, absolutely terrible efficiency. The week before that, 14 yards to Najee on 6 carries and 12 to Jalen Warren as well. Also, 92 yards to Chuba the week before that, which is awesome, but on 26 carries. That is a 3.5 yard per carry mark. Again, very bad efficiency there. The Eagles defense is giving up 18.9 points per game to opposing offenses. That's good for 5th best in the NFL, and only 218 yards as well. That's number 1 by far. And the Cowboys offense is depleted right now. We have Cooper Rush at quarterback. He's not amazing. He's been playing pretty decent though, all things considered, but CeeDee Lamb is now out for this week and the rest of the 2 weeks for the season, meaning their top wide receiver talent is Brandon Cooks and Jake Ferguson. This offense is going to struggle, and the books have that projected. This game is on the lower side as far as a projected total at 38.5 points. That's the second lowest of the week, only behind the Saints and the Raiders at 37.5. That should already tell you how bad of a potential matchup this could be for this team, and the Eagles are also favored by 6.5 points heading into this game, so that's insinuating that this is going to be a pass-first script in the second half, and the Cowboys probably won't generate a ton of dynamic offense. You can imagine if the Cowboys struggle in the ground game and the Eagles go up by a touchdown or 2 touchdowns by half, they could completely abandon the run game and stop pushing that narrative. It's happened so many times to teams that the Eagles play this year. We've seen that. Now, there is a slight chance with Jalen Hurts out missing this week, this could be a closer game. Maybe it stays close and the running backs actually get a good amount of volume, but the books know everything. Vegas knows everything, and they still are 10 steps ahead of us. They have the Eagles winning by a touchdown, even with Kenny Pickett at quarterback. This team has enough talent on it with Saquon, with AJ Brown, everybody healthy, that they could potentially still win this game by a good amount. Even with the weather concerns here in this matchup, it's going to add to the downside. But unfortunately, to literally everybody, Jerry Jeudy has to be sat this week at no fault, but everybody but himself. We've seen with Winston, he's been absolutely amazing. Every single game that he's started with Winston since week 8, he's the wide receiver 4 in that stretch. So the first week with DTR, last week as a starter, he gets 3 targets on 34 of DTR's passing attempts. That's an absolutely atrocious target share, and now he's starting again in this matchup against the Dolphins. But you might think that, okay, maybe there's a little bit of hope here. It was the first start for DTR. David Njoku got almost half of the targets here, and he's going to be out for this matchup. Maybe we can get some opportunities in the way of Jerry Jeudy. I wish that was the case. We have Jalen Ramsey guarding Jerry Jeudy for this week. That's one of the most negative cornerback matchups you could possibly get. If you don't know how negative it is, let me put you onto that perspective. Despite having to match up against every single team's best wide receiver in a cornerback wide receiver matchup that you'd think would get a lot of targets because it's still the number 1 guy on the team, he's averaging a 10.8% target share on the year to wide receivers he guards. That's the 4th lowest out of every single corner in the league. And when they do get targeted and utilized, they're averaging 0.2 fantasy points per route run. That's tied for the 7th lowest allowed by any cornerback this year. The guy's legit. Like, we know this based on the season numbers and smart coaching. They probably won't look Jerry Jeudy's way a ton. You'd expect this because of what Jalen Ramsey has been doing, potential loss of downs because of it, and not to mention the Dolphins as a collective allow the number 1 least amount of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. And to make matters even worse, on top of all of this negative matchup talk, the rain is forecast to be pretty bad in Cleveland for this matchup. I promise you, any bit of drizzle of rain is going to restrict DTR and what he's able to do. He has the lowest ADOT out of any quarterback last week. That's going to continue again if the weather does happen to be an issue. Even if it doesn't, it's not a good spot. I can only imagine that he'd have to stick to Elijah Moore in the short slot game, because how often is he going to throw deep downfield? But we also have to be sitting Christian Watson and tempering our expectations. I know this game has a high game total, so maybe there's some opportunity for upside here, but there should be a ton of offense. That is a 100% fact. Both of these teams are top 10 as far as offensive efficiency. This game is huge for playoff implications, but ever since Romeo Doubs came back into this offense from being injured in week 15, it's completely complicated this wide receiver room, causing Watson to score 8.6 and 2.3 fantasy points over his last 2 weeks. Now, to be fair, he was injured last week. He came out early, but if we take a look into the wide receiver snap splits as far as those last 2 weeks and pretty much the entire season, it's all the way messed up. There was no number one wide receiver in this offense. When we thought Jayden Reed was getting that, he completely did nothing and took himself out of games. He's not a wide receiver one. As far as a fantasy perspective, it doesn't look good for any of these guys, and anybody can have a big game at potential, but if there's any good news, it's going to be that Watson is playing the most snaps on average per all of these wide receivers. The bad news is when you look at week 15, the one game where everybody was fully healthy, another thing that we're going to get in week 17, 75% of the snaps for Romeo Doubs, 59 for Jayden Reed, 78 for Watson, and 47 for Wicks. That's 4 wide receivers essentially at a 50% or higher snap share. The upside can only be so high if that is the case. We know Watson to be a deep threat wide receiver. He doesn't need a ton of receptions to have a big day, which is a plus for him, but his best fantasy day was 19 fantasy points, and it came on 4 receptions for 150 yards. That was his season high in receptions with 4. It's an amazing matchup. Yes, the Vikings are top 5 in fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. Again, kind of making people want to put him in their starting lineups, but more specifically, he does get a matchup against Shaquille Griffin, who's allowing a 12.2% target share to the wide receivers he guards and 0.2 fantasy points per reception. That's not great. That's bottom 10 in the NFL, especially coming into this matchup, limited as an injury for Christian Watson. All wide receiver competition is going to be healthy. The risk here just does not outweigh the potential upside that we could get with him in this matchup. But if you had any thought to outsmart everybody and put Brandon Cooks in our starting lineups because he's the wide receiver one with no CeeDee Lamb, I'm going to make it quick. Do not do that. Just take him out of your starting lineups. With Lamb being out for the rest of the year, yes, it does open up about 10 targets a game and some opportunity for some other guys, but it also means that he's forced to play against every single team's number one cornerback week in and week out. It's going to be a negative matchup every week. It's even worse now against Cooper DeJean and Quinyon Mitchell. They are both allowing under a 0.2 fantasy point per route run number. That number is the 5th best in the NFL, and as a combined corner duo, that is the 2nd hardest. Like, it's not good. There's no room to work here, and the Eagles defense as a whole, as we talked about with Rico Dowdle, is top 5 in every statistic. They don't allow a lot of points. We can see that through the Cowboys being 6.5 point underdogs, so maybe they'll stick to the pass game a bit more. Brandon Cooks can get some opportunities, but again, the upside isn't in the realm of possibilities to where we need to be going through and putting him in our starting lineups, but we also do need to be sitting another wide receiver here, one with a lot more name value. It's going to be Amari Cooper. He's been absolutely terrible since joining the Bills. His name value, again, is the only thing that's keeping him rostered and started in over 40% of leagues. His best game with this team was 15.5 points against the Rams in week 14. That was a positive matchup. I'll get into that later, but now he gets a bad one against the Jets here, who are one of the most negative in allowing wide receiver points this year, especially with the cornerback matchup. DJ Reed is allowing 0.21 fantasy points per route run, which is tied for the 10th lowest in the NFL. That's also a 15.1% target share to opposing wide receivers. It's a negative spot for all of these guys. Khalil Shakir, Keon Coleman, they all get bad ones. The cornerback duo and this team as a whole is allowing the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to opposing wide receivers on the year, and the Bills again are favored by 8.5 points. If this game gets out of hand early, they could exclusively stick with James Cook and the run game. That has been the way to get an edge over the Jets so far this year, especially when all of their corners and safeties are healthy. The utilization there is going to be pretty good for the running backs, but Cooper himself, he hasn't really done much to earn a starting spot in your starting lineup here. Since his first game with the Bills in week 7, he's averaging 6.7 fantasy points per game and only 4 targets, 2.4 receptions because of that. Like, that's just not good. That's including the fluke game against the Rams where he dropped 15 points. That game as a total had 86 points scored and 902 total yards of offense. That led him to see 6 receptions for 95 yards, and if you take out that one game, he's averaging 24 yards since becoming a Bill. He barely has any snaps. He plays about 50% a game. The books have him projected for 24.5 receiving yards again. It's almost a lock that he just doesn't have a breakout game. It's a very tough Jets secondary. Don't be risking him and putting him in your starting lineup. But on top of that, in the same matchup, a quarterback, the one that we need to be sitting in all of our matchups here, is going to be Aaron Rodgers. Put him on the bench immediately. He gets a matchup here against the Bills, which is more on the negative side. They allow the 11th least amount of points to opposing quarterbacks. This game total is at 46.5 points. It's on the higher side, but the Bills are favored by 8.5 points, putting the Jets at one of the lowest team totals of the week. The only bright side here is going to be the pass volume for Aaron Rodgers. He's 9 9th in that aspect. He's also 9th in passing touchdowns as well. The books have him projected for 32 passing attempts this week. Not bad at all. It's actually pretty good. He has been pretty good since his week 12 bye, averaging 18.9 fantasy points in that 4-week stretch, but it ends here. The Bills defense has been getting a little bit worse over the past few weeks. Again, maybe there's some holes to take advantage of, but he absolutely requires at least 2 passing touchdowns to be considered, especially if you're in a 4-point per passing touchdown league. I don't see his highest upside potential game to really be worth the risk that he does bring, especially with the weather concerns here in Buffalo. On Sunday, there was an 80% chance of rain from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. Like, the entire day is going to be dealing with rain. It's going to be its worst at about 2-3 o'clock. If it does end up being a problem, it could severely hinder this pass game and let them stick more to the run. It's more positive against the Bills defense as well. Their pass defense is better than their run defense. That's going to finish out this video though. Thank you guys so much for rocking with me for the entire fantasy football season. All glory to the man above.